The tension on Flight 267 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers murmured in frustration as boarding dragged on longer than expected. At the center of it all was an elderly black man, moving slowly down the aisle with a cane in one hand and a small leather bag in the other. "Come on, old man. Some of us have places to be." A man in a suit snapped, rolling his eyes. A few others joined in, sighing loudly, shaking their heads. The old man didn't say a word. He simply kept moving, his expression unreadable. But moments later, when the flight attendant addressed him by name, the entire cabin fell silent. Then came the whispers, then the wide eyes of realization, and soon after the apologies. As the old man finally reached his seat, a younger passenger huffed in annoyance. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The murmurs of discontent rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged knowing glances, as if silently agreeing that this man was holding up the flight for no good reason. A woman near the window even turned to her companion and whispered, "Why do they always take so long? If he can't move faster, maybe he shouldn't be flying alone." The flight attendant, a composed woman in her mid-40s, approached with a patient smile. "Sir, would you like some help with your bag?" she asked gently. The old man nodded slightly, allowing her to take his small leather bag and stow it away in the overhead compartment. Then, he lowered himself into his seat with quiet dignity. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if he had carried the weight of time itself. Just as the last few passengers settled in, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a smooth flight today with minimal turbulence. Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for takeoff." As the plane taxied down the runway, the younger man who had scoffed earlier leaned toward the old man and muttered, "Hope you don't slow us down when we land too." His voice carried a sharp edge, the kind that masked his own impatience as something justified. The old man remained silent. He didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, he gazed out of the window, his deep brown eyes reflecting the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. Then, the flight attendant returned, kneeling slightly beside him. "Mr. Carter," she said with warmth in her voice, "I just want to say it's an honor to have you on board today. If there's anything you need, please let me know." The moment his name left her lips, the entire section of the plane seemed to freeze. Several heads turned. The man in the suit, the woman by the window, and the younger passenger all glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from irritation to confusion. "Wait, Mr. Carter?" Couldn't be. The name carried weight, familiar yet impossible. The same Mr. Carter whose legacy was etched into history books, whose face had once been on television screens, whose contributions had shaped lives. The murmurs started again, but this time, they weren't whispers of annoyance. They were hushed voices of realization. The young man who had scoffed at him suddenly felt his face flush with embarrassment. Then, hesitantly, he asked, "Excuse me, sir, are you that Mr. Carter?" The old man turned from the window, his gaze calm but piercing. He gave a small, tired smile. "I suppose that depends," he said quietly. "Who do you think I am?" A heavy silence settled over the cabin. The young man who had mocked Mr. Carter earlier swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his seatbelt. The other passengers, who had been irritated just moments ago, now sat motionless, waiting for his response. Mr. Carter didn't rush. His deep, knowing eyes held the weight of a man who had been in this situation before, one too familiar with the moment when others realized they had misjudged him. Finally, a soft voice broke the silence. From across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with graying hair leaned forward. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the Mr. Carter from the Carter Foundation?" As soon as the words left her lips, a ripple spread through the cabin. An older man a few rows ahead let out a quiet gasp. A younger woman pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as if searching for something. The Carter Foundation, a name deeply embedded in American history, a nonprofit organization that had funded hundreds of scholarships, built libraries in underserved communities, and tirelessly fought for the rights of the marginalized. Mr. Carter gave a small, measured nod. His expression didn't change. He neither gloated nor seemed surprised by their reaction. A murmur spread through the rows. The businessman who had been so impatient with him suddenly shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The young man who had scoffed at him moments ago felt his face flush with shame. I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I didn't know." Mr. Carter gave him a quiet, understanding look. "You didn't know," he repeated calmly. "But does that change the way you should have treated me?" The young man's breath hitched. He had no response, and neither did anyone else. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? If Mr. Carter had been just an ordinary elderly man, without fame, without achievements, would their irritation have been justified? A sense of guilt settled over the passengers. No one spoke for a while. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign had turned off, but no one rushed to get up. They were still processing what had just happened. Then the middle-aged woman spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Carter, I just want to say thank you. My niece, she received a scholarship from the Carter Foundation last year. Without you, she wouldn't have been able to attend college." Mr. Carter's expression softened. He gave a slow nod, not just in acknowledgement of her words, but as if he were silently thanking the many people who had walked beside him in his lifelong mission to help others. A voice from the front of the cabin chimed in. "I used to work at one of the libraries your foundation built," an older man said. "It changed the lives of so many kids in my neighborhood." Another passenger added, "I'm a teacher at a public school, and your reading programs have helped so many of my students catch up instead of falling behind." One by one, people started speaking. Stories poured out of children who had been educated, families who had been lifted up, communities that had been restored, all because of the man they had been so quick to judge. And the young man? He lowered his head, unable to hide his shame. When he finally found the courage to look up, his eyes met Mr. Carter's. "I truly apologize," he said, his voice quieter this time, "not just for what I said, but for how I thought." Mr. Carter gave him a small, kind smile. He nodded gently. "Realizing your mistake is the first step," he said. "What matters is what you do next." And this time, those words weren't just for the young man. They were for everyone on that flight. The young man sat in silence, absorbing Mr. Carter's words. Around him, other passengers remained unusually still, as if reluctant to return to their books, devices, or in-flight entertainment. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air. After a long pause, Mr. Carter finally spoke again. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable depth. "You know," he said, "I wasn't always Mr. Carter, the one people recognize. I was just a boy from a small town in Mississippi. A boy who wasn't supposed to make it." A few heads turned his way, curiosity piqued. The young man who had insulted him earlier leaned in slightly, listening. "I was born in 1942, Mr. Carter continued, his gaze drifting out the window as if watching memories unfold in the clouds. "Back then, opportunities weren't meant for boys like me. My father was a laborer, my mother a housemaid. I was the youngest of 6, and none of my siblings finished high school. The world already had a plan for me. I was supposed to work in the fields, maybe pick up shifts at the factory, and that would be my life." The businessman in the suit, who had previously rolled his eyes at Mr. Carter's slow pace, now found himself hanging on to every word. "But I had a teacher," Mr. Carter said, a hint of a smile forming. "Mrs. Reynolds. She saw something in me that no one else did. When I was 10, she handed me my first real book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and told me, 'Keep reading, Lewis. You're going to do something great one day.'" A few passengers exchanged glances. They could hear the affection in his voice, the way he said her name. "She used to sneak me books when my parents couldn't afford them. I would read by candlelight at night, long after I was supposed to be asleep. And when I turned 13, she marched right up to my father's doorstep and told him, 'This boy needs an education.'" A chuckle rippled through the cabin, but it was filled with admiration, not amusement. "My father wasn't convinced, but Mrs. Reynolds didn't back down. She found a scholarship program that would pay for my schooling. That was the first time in my life someone fought for me." Mr. Carter paused, his fingers lightly tracing the armrest. "The thing is," he continued, "people see me now and assume I've always been this version of myself. But they don't see the nights I spent scrubbing floors to afford college. They don't see the doors slammed in my face when I tried to build something for my community. They don't see the years I spent being ignored, dismissed, treated exactly the way I was treated today." The young man's face burned with shame. "But none of that matters," Mr. Carter said gently, "because I had a choice. I could either become bitter or I could become better. I chose the second option." Silence stretched between them, and then a voice from the back of the plane. "Mrs. Reynolds would be proud of you." Mr. Carter chuckled softly. "I'd like to think so." The young man cleared his throat. He still felt the weight of his earlier words, but now there was something else, a realization. "I wish I had met her," he admitted. Mr. Carter turned to him, his eyes kind but knowing. "You have," he said simply. "You meet her every time someone believes in you, every time someone gives you a chance. And you have the power to be someone's Mrs. Reynolds too." The young man sat with that thought, turning it over in his mind. He had spent years chasing status, success, recognition, but what had he really done to uplift anyone else? The flight attendant returned then, offering Mr. Carter a cup of tea. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked. Mr. Carter shook his head. "I have everything I need right here." And for the first time since takeoff, the young man truly understood what he meant. The rest of the flight passed in a thoughtful silence. The hum of the engines, the occasional clinking of glasses, and the low murmur of conversations filled the cabin, but something had shifted. The air felt different, lighter, yet deeper. The young man sat quietly, processing everything Mr. Carter had said. He thought about his own life, his ambitions, his relentless pursuit of success, the way he had often dismissed people he deemed unimportant. How many times had he rushed past an elderly person struggling to carry groceries? How many moments had he missed where he could have been someone's Mrs. Reynolds? His thoughts were interrupted when the captain announced the plane's descent. Passengers began preparing for landing, tucking away books, stretching stiff limbs, fastening seatbelts. As the wheels touched down, the businessman in the suit turned to Mr. Carter and extended a hand. "I misjudged you," he admitted, "and I'm sorry for that." Mr. Carter took his hand in a firm but warm grip. "It happens," he said simply. "What matters is what you do next." The businessman nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. As passengers began disembarking, the young man hesitated. He wanted to say something more, to make this moment last a little longer. Finally, he found the words. "Mr. Carter, I don't know if I'll ever be able to do what you've done," he confessed. "But I want to try. I want to be better." Mr. Carter smiled, a deep, knowing smile. He patted the young man's shoulder as he stood. "Then start small," he said. "Be kind when no one's watching. Help when there's nothing in it for you. And one day, you'll realize you've made a difference." The young man nodded, his chest tightening with something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. As they stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Mr. Carter disappeared into the crowd, moving at his own slow but steady pace. And the young man? For the first time in his life, he wasn't in a rush. He took a deep breath and smiled. It was time to start walking at a different pace.